The unexpected encounter. The morning air in Portland had a crisp edge to it as autumn's chill began to settle over the city. The sun had barely risen, casting a soft golden glow over the streets. A few early risers hurried along the sidewalks, their footsteps quick against the damp concrete, eager to start their day. But inside the Morning Brew Cafe, a different kind of energy filled the room. The clinking of coffee cups, the hum of conversation, and the soft jazz playing in the background created a warm and inviting atmosphere. It was a place where locals gathered to recharge, where the world outside felt distant, and time moved a little slower. Sergeant Lisa Johnson, a seasoned Army veteran, stepped through the cafe's door. Her duffel bag slung over her shoulder, her eyes scanning the room for a place to settle. She had just arrived from a late-night flight, her body still heavy with the exhaustion of travel. All she wanted was a quiet breakfast and a hot cup of coffee. She was no stranger to the hum of airports and layovers, but today felt different. It was a strange kind of peace that wrapped around her as she pushed the door open and entered the warmth of the cafe. The cafe was bustling with the usual crowd. Regulars murmured to each other over the news of the day, commuters sipped coffee before heading to work, and the warmth of the place provided comfort against the early morning chill. Lisa's footsteps were soft against the floor as she made her way to an empty table near the window, grateful for the peace that enveloped her. She set down her bag with a tired sigh, feeling the weight of the journey she had just completed. Her simple presence had already begun to stir the atmosphere around her. At the counter, Emily, a young waitress in her 20s, noticed Lisa's entrance. There was nothing particularly remarkable about the woman, dressed in casual clothes, a jacket over her uniform. The tiredness in her eyes was visible from the get-go, the weariness of someone used to long shifts and constant movement. But what drew Emily's attention wasn't just Lisa's appearance. It was the duffel bag she carried with her. The bag, worn and faded from years of use, seemed heavy and out of place in the cozy cafe. It was an old military-style duffel, one that made Emily pause, her instincts kicking in before logic could catch up. The room continued its rhythm, but Emily couldn't help but feel unsettled. She had heard about the recent rise in tensions, the random acts of violence, and the whispered rumors of growing hostility everywhere. Something about Lisa didn't sit right with Emily, and her heart beat a little faster. She shifted nervously, wiping her hands on her apron as she watched Lisa settle into her chair, unpacking her things with the casualness of someone used to traveling. The knot in Emily's chest tightened. She wasn't sure why, but there was a palpable sense of unease she couldn't shake. Lisa's posture was erect and alert, the duffel bag a stark reminder of something that felt out of place in this peaceful setting. Emily knew she had to approach her. She had no real reason to be suspicious, but her instincts urged her to do so. Without realizing it, her feet had already carried her toward Lisa's table. She stopped just short, her gaze lingering on the duffel bag. Her thoughts scattered, and a small sense of panic began to rise within her. The bag, its heavy presence, something about it made Emily uneasy. It wasn't just the bag. It was the entire aura of Lisa's presence. Her every movement was measured, purposeful, and somehow out of sync with the relaxed energy of the cafe. Emily cleared her throat, trying to steady her voice. "Good morning," she said, her tone wavering just a little. It wasn't so much a greeting as it was an opening for what she had already decided to do. Lisa looked up, her deep brown eyes meeting Emily's with calm recognition. "Morning," she replied evenly, her voice strong and steady, carrying the quiet authority that often came with years of service. She didn't seem out of place, despite the duffel bag. Emily felt the hesitation ripple through her chest as she studied Lisa's face, searching for signs of discomfort, for some reason to be suspicious. "Are you okay?" Emily asked, her voice faltering. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but there was a sense of tension around Lisa that felt off. Emily's gaze flicked down to the duffel bag again, as if expecting it to give some kind of answer. Lisa glanced around the room, her face serene. "No," she replied simply, her tone still steady. Just here for breakfast." She motioned toward the empty table by the window. "Do you mind if I sit here?" The question hung in the air. Emily hesitated. Her mind raced, every instinct telling her to walk away, to mind her business. But the bag, its worn edges, the subtle but undeniable presence of the military design, it unsettled her. Her eyes flicked toward the bar where Jack, another server, was watching them. She could feel the eyes of the cafe on her, even though everything around them seemed perfectly ordinary. "I'm sorry," Emily said, her voice shifting, not as warm now, but edged with caution. "But I have to ask you about the bag. It's just part of our routine here. There's been some security issues with everything going on in the news lately." The weight of her words hung between them, creating an invisible barrier. Lisa's brow furrowed slightly, and for a moment, Emily thought she saw a flicker of irritation rise inside her. Lisa had been through enough tense situations to recognize when someone was sizing her up, but she didn't let it show. "It's just my personal belongings," Lisa said evenly, her voice calm. A slight smile tugged at her lips, an attempt to put Emily at ease. "I've been traveling. No need to worry." But Emily wasn't convinced. Her eyes scanned Lisa's face, taking in the military jacket, the duffel bag, the way Lisa carried herself with the alertness of someone always aware of her surroundings. Emily shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting back to Jack, still watching them, his face unreadable. The unease in her chest only grew. "It's really just my bag," Lisa added, her tone starting to hold a note of frustration. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I just need to grab a cup of coffee and relax for a bit." But Emily wasn't backing down. Her eyes never left the bag. "I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to let us check it," she said, her voice trembling slightly. She looked over her shoulder, as if expecting a larger presence to back her up. Lisa's expression shifted. Her jaw tightened, her eyes locking with Emily's. "Excuse me?" she asked, her voice firm, but the frustration evident beneath the calm. Emily took a deep breath, glancing back toward Jack once more. Her mind was racing. The unease she felt wasn't going away. She knew what she had to do next, even though she hated the thought of it. "Ma'am," she said slowly, her voice now strained, "we have to follow the protocol. Just let us check your bag, please." The words hung in the air, cutting through the silence of the cafe. The tension between them was palpable. Lisa's patience, built over years of service in the military, was starting to fray. There was no threat in her. She had only come for a peaceful breakfast, a moment of respite after a long journey. But now she was being treated like a criminal. The call, the weight of Emily's words, the sudden, suffocating air between them. The words felt like a slap in the face, and for a moment, Lisa wasn't sure how to process it. She had just wanted a cup of coffee. She wasn't looking for trouble. And now here she was, being judged based on her appearance, her uniform, her duffel bag. "I'm not here to hurt anyone," Lisa said, her voice low, but firm. "I'm just tired and hungry. I've been on a plane all night." She took a step forward, her body tall and steady. "Please," she continued, her voice a little softer, "just let me eat in peace." Emily's hand trembled slightly as she looked down at her phone, her mind torn between duty and uncertainty. The weight of the decision pressed heavily on her shoulders, and for the first time, she wasn't sure she was doing the right thing. But the words had already left her mouth. The call had already been made. The silence stretched longer than either of them anticipated. The hum of the cafe faded into the background. The door jangled open with a sharp sound, and a cold gust of wind blew in. The doorbell rang again as a man in a navy blue uniform entered. Sergeant Greg Thomas, a seasoned Portland officer with a weathered face and calm demeanor, walked into the cafe. He had a crisp uniform, boots that clicked lightly against the floor, and a familiar presence that immediately caught Emily's attention. Greg raised an eyebrow as he approached the counter, noticing the tension between Emily and Lisa. He asked, in his calm voice, "Everything all right here?" Emily, caught off guard by his sudden presence, hesitated. She quickly glanced at Lisa and then back at Greg. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," she stammered. "This lady came in, and well, I asked to check her bag." But before she could explain further, Greg held up his hand, signaling for Emily to stop. He assessed the situation. Lisa's posture, the bags under her eyes, the exhaustion she carried, the uniform, the duffel bag. All of it seemed so familiar. "Ma'am," Greg said, addressing Lisa directly, "can you explain what's going on?" Lisa's jaw clenched. She had been asked to explain herself too many times, been through too many situations where she had to defend her actions. But here, in this cafe, she wasn't sure why she needed to explain herself again. "I've done nothing wrong," she replied firmly, her voice cutting through the tension. "I'm just here for some breakfast. I was traveling all night. I just need a moment to relax." Greg nodded slowly, taking her words in. He turned back to Emily, his gaze softening slightly. "Emily, you need to understand that every person has their own story, their own reasons for being here. You can't make assumptions based on fear alone." Emily felt a rush of shame flood her as the weight of Greg's words hit her. She hadn't wanted to escalate things. She had simply followed protocol. But now, seeing Lisa's calm demeanor, the exhaustion in her eyes, and the dignity with which she carried herself, she realized that she had made a mistake. "I'm sorry," Greg said to Lisa, his voice apologetic. "We'll make sure this gets cleared up." Emily, feeling the weight of the moment, rushed to fulfill Lisa's order, her heart heavy with the realization that what had started as a simple misunderstanding had turned into something far more complex. And for the first time that morning, Lisa allowed herself a small moment of relief. The ripple effect. The coffee arrived at Lisa's table, steaming hot and full of promise. She wrapped her hands around the mug, grateful for the warmth. For a few moments, all that existed was the quiet comfort of the moment. The bustling energy of the cafe, once so alive with chatter and movement, had now slowed into an awkward silence. Lisa could feel the eyes of the other patrons lingering on her, even if they pretended not to. The air seemed thicker, heavier, as though the cafe had shifted in some fundamental way. As Lisa sipped the coffee, she tried to ground herself in the present, to quiet the storm of thoughts swirling in her mind. She hadn't expected her morning to go this way. A simple breakfast had turned into a confrontation, an emotional reckoning she hadn't asked for. It wasn't the first time she had been looked at as a threat, but it was one of the rare moments where it felt so tangible, so immediate. The way Emily had treated her, like an intruder, like someone who didn't belong. It was a bitter reminder of the invisible line she crossed when she became a soldier, when she put on the uniform and carried the weight of the world on her shoulders. She stared out the window, trying to push away the sense of isolation that had settled over her. The streets of Portland were busy as always, people rushing to work, cars honking in the distance, joggers weaving through the crowd. Life continued outside, oblivious to the internal storm she was weathering. Her fingers tightened around the mug, the warmth of the coffee grounding her in a momentary escape. Yet the truth was undeniable. The world she had fought for, the freedom she had protected with her life, felt distant in this moment. She wasn't just a veteran. She was an outsider, a woman carrying a heavy bag, labeled before she even had a chance to speak. The tension in the cafe felt like a physical presence now, a weight on her chest that wouldn't lift. But just as the silence seemed to stretch to its breaking point, the door opened again, the bell above it jingling as a gust of cold air blew into the cafe. This time, it wasn't a police officer walking in, but a woman with an easy smile and a warm energy that seemed to sweep through the room like a breath of fresh air. Sergeant Johnson. Lisa looked up, surprised. She didn't recognize the woman, but there was something comforting about the way she carried herself. Her eyes sparkled with curiosity, and her expression was one of genuine interest. "Yes," Lisa replied, her voice guarded but polite. The woman's smile widened. "I'm Sarah Peterson," she said, extending a hand. I'm actually a fellow veteran. I couldn't help but notice you were sitting alone. And I thought, well, it's not every day you meet another vet in a cafe. Lisa hesitated for a moment, her hand stiff with uncertainty. She hadn't expected this kind of encounter, certainly not in the middle of a morning that had already taken such a difficult turn. But something in Sarah's voice, in her warmth, made Lisa feel like this was a chance at something different. She reached out and shook Sarah's hand firmly. "It's good to meet you," Lisa said softly, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. She hadn't realized how tense she had been until this moment. Sarah's easygoing nature was like a balm, a reprieve from the tension that had surrounded her all morning. Sarah pulled out a chair and sat down across from Lisa, her eyes briefly glancing toward Emily, who was still standing near the counter, her arms crossed tightly. Sarah noticed the subtle shift in the air, the tension between Emily and Lisa that still lingered, though it had softened. But Sarah didn't address it directly. Instead, she turned her full attention to Lisa, as though she truly wanted to understand her story. "You don't see many of us around these parts," Sarah continued, a slight grin tugging at her lips, "especially not in places like this. I take it you're not from around here." Lisa shook her head, her gaze drifting out the window again as she tried to collect her thoughts. "No, I'm just passing through. I was in town for a conference, and I needed some time to clear my head," she said quietly. "I didn't expect this." Sarah nodded, her eyes soft with understanding. "I get it," she said, her voice steady. "There's a lot of misunderstanding out there, especially when it comes to veterans. People look at us, and they don't always see the whole picture. They don't always understand the weight we carry." Lisa felt her chest tighten. The familiar ache of being misunderstood resurfaced. But in Sarah's presence, it didn't feel quite as sharp. There was something calming about the way Sarah spoke, the way she seemed to understand without needing an explanation. Lisa had often felt like she was walking around with a weight no one could see, no one could understand. But Sarah's words were different. They cut through the fog of frustration and self-doubt, offering a glimpse of the empathy Lisa had been craving. "I know what it's like," Sarah continued, her gaze lingering on Lisa. "To be treated like an outsider, like you're just a threat, a danger. It's not easy." "I know." Lisa's heart tightened in her chest. She hadn't expected to hear those words. Not from someone she had just met, not from a complete stranger. But in that moment, the quiet dignity in Sarah's voice felt like a lifeline. "I didn't ask for this," Lisa said, her voice thick with emotion. "I didn't ask for people to treat me like I'm some, I don't even know what. But I've fought for this country. I've given everything. And now, I walk into a cafe, and I'm looked at like a criminal." Sarah didn't answer immediately. She let Lisa's words hang in the air, giving them room to breathe, to settle. There was a depth to the silence between them, a shared understanding that didn't need words to be communicated. "You didn't deserve that," Sarah said finally, her voice steady. "No one should be treated like that, especially not someone who has served this country." Lisa nodded slowly, the lump in her throat thickening. She hadn't realized how much she needed to hear those words, how much she had been longing for someone to see her for who she really was, not the uniform, not the bag, but the person beneath it all. For a moment, there was silence between them. Lisa's mind swirled with thoughts of Emily, of the police, of the life she had led. But Sarah's presence, her understanding, felt like a warm embrace, a reminder that there were still people out there who saw her as more than just a veteran, more than just a woman with a bag. "I don't know what happens next," Lisa said finally, her voice quieter now. "I don't know if Emily realizes what she's done, or if I can just walk away from this." Sarah smiled softly, her eyes kind. "Sometimes all you can do is take the next step," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "One at a time. And for the first time today, I think you've taken a step towards something different." Lisa didn't know if she fully understood what Sarah meant, but in that moment, she felt something inside her shift. She wasn't alone. Not completely. Not anymore. The warmth of the cafe, the easy hum of conversation in the background, began to feel a little more comforting. The tension that had filled the air earlier, the weight of suspicion and judgment, began to fade into something quieter, something less suffocating. As Sarah stood to leave, she gave Lisa one last, reassuring smile. "Take care of yourself," she said softly. "You're not alone, Sergeant." Lisa watched her walk toward the door, feeling the strange sense of peace wash over her. Sarah's departure was like a breath of fresh air, an affirmation that even in a world that often misunderstood her, there were still people who saw the truth of her struggle, the truth of her humanity. The door chimed again as Sarah left, and the cafe settled back into its rhythm. But for Lisa, the silence that followed felt different now. It wasn't empty or oppressive. It was a quiet reflection, a space for her to breathe. The weight of what had happened still lingered, but now there was something else, a quiet resolve. Lisa wasn't just a woman sitting alone at a table anymore. She wasn't just the sum of her experiences, the military jacket, the duffel bag. She was a person, a woman who had fought for her country, and for the first time today, she felt like she wasn't fighting alone. She had a small but real connection, a connection that made her feel, for the first time in a long time, like she mattered. But before she could fully settle into that thought, Emily approached again. Her shoulders were slumped, her eyes avoiding Lisa's gaze. She hesitated in the doorway before stepping inside. The guilt was palpable, hanging between them like a heavy mist. "I'm really sorry," Emily said, her voice soft, almost unsure. She took a cautious step into the cafe, her eyes flicking to Lisa's face before quickly averting her gaze again. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I shouldn't have treated you like that." Lisa, still processing the events of the morning, felt a knot form in her stomach. She wasn't sure how to respond. The sting of the earlier exchange was still there, but Emily's apology felt sincere. It wasn't an easy thing to admit when you were wrong, especially when that wrong had been so public, so stark. Lisa wasn't sure if she could just walk away from it, if the hurt would just disappear. But she did know one thing. In that moment, she wasn't the only one who needed healing. She inhaled slowly, meeting Emily's gaze. "I understand fear," she said, her voice steady, but filled with an emotion she wasn't quite ready to unpack. "Fear can make you do things you wouldn't normally do. It can cloud your judgment, make you see things that aren't there." "I get that." Emily's eyes searched Lisa's face, her hands trembling slightly, as though looking for forgiveness, for some sign that this moment of vulnerability wouldn't break them. Lisa offered a small, tired smile. It wasn't forgiveness, not completely, but it was a step toward understanding. "Fear's a tricky thing," Lisa said quietly, "but it's also a human thing. We all have it." The silence between them stretched for a moment longer before Emily nodded, relief washing over her. She wasn't sure what would come next, but at least the tension between them had softened, replaced with something far more fragile, humanity. And for Lisa, that was a start. Confronting the shadows. The soft hum of the cafe returned as Emily stepped back toward the counter, her apology lingering in the air like an unresolved note in a symphony. Lisa watched her retreat, her expression unreadable, but her thoughts were anything but still. The emotions from the encounter churned within her, a swirling storm of frustration, exhaustion, and a flicker of empathy she hadn't expected to feel. The warmth of the coffee in her hands did little to soothe the tension in her chest, but it gave her something to hold onto, a small anchor in the midst of the emotional chaos. Lisa's eyes drifted back to the window. The bustling streets of Portland continued unabated. People moved with purpose, their lives oblivious to the turmoil that had unfolded within the walls of the cafe. Lisa wondered how many of them carried unseen battles, how many of them bore scars that no one else could see. It was a question she often asked herself, especially on days like this when her own burdens felt too heavy to carry alone. Her thoughts were interrupted as the door opened again, the bell jingling sharply. This time, it wasn't another officer or a passerby, but a man in his late 40s with a commanding presence. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his hair graying at the temples, and his eyes sharp and perceptive. He wore a jacket with a small patch on the sleeve, a symbol Lisa instantly recognized, the insignia of a veterans support group. The man scanned the room briefly before his gaze landed on Lisa. His expression softened as he approached her table. "Sergeant Johnson?" he asked, his voice warm but firm. Lisa blinked, caught off guard by the familiarity in his tone. She didn't recognize him, but something about his demeanor put her at ease. "Yes," she replied, her voice cautious. He extended a hand. "I'm Marcus Fielding. I run a veterans outreach program here in Portland. Sarah Peterson mentioned you. She said you might need someone to talk to." Lisa hesitated for a moment before shaking his hand. His grip was firm, steady, a reassuring presence that reminded her of the camaraderie she had once known in the military. "I appreciate the gesture, but I'm fine," she said, her tone polite but distant. She wasn't sure if she was ready to unpack everything that had happened, let alone with a stranger. Marcus pulled out a chair and sat across from her without waiting for an invitation, his movements deliberate but non-threatening. "I'm not here to pry," he said, his voice steady. "I just wanted to offer some support. I've been where you are, feeling like the world doesn't quite know what to do with you once you're out of uniform." Lisa's gaze narrowed slightly. She didn't know whether to feel comforted or irritated by his words. "You don't even know me," she said, her voice edged with a touch of defensiveness. Marcus nodded, unfazed. "You're right. I don't. But I know the look in your eyes. I've seen it in myself, in others I've worked with. You walk into a room, and it feels like everyone's already decided who you are before you've said a word." Lisa's jaw tightened, his words striking closer to home than she cared to admit. "And what do you think you see?" she asked, her tone challenging. Marcus leaned back slightly, his gaze steady but kind. "I see someone who's carried more than her fair share of weight, someone who's probably been let down by the very people she's fought to protect, and someone who's trying to find her place in a world that doesn't make it easy." Lisa exhaled sharply, the tension in her chest loosening just a fraction. She hated how accurately he had read her, but she couldn't deny the truth in his words. "That's a lot to assume," she said quietly. "Maybe," Marcus admitted, his tone lightening. "But I've been wrong before, and I don't mind being wrong now. I just wanted to say that you're not alone, Sergeant. Whatever you're carrying, there are people who understand, people who've been there." The sincerity in his voice disarmed her, chipping away at the walls she had built around herself. She wanted to push him away, to tell him she didn't need anyone's pity. But the truth was, she did feel alone. More alone than she had in years. Before she could respond, Marcus leaned forward slightly, his expression softening. "Sarah told me a little about what happened this morning. I don't know the whole story, but I do know this. You didn't deserve to be treated like that. No one does." Lisa's throat tightened, the weight of the morning's events pressing down on her again. "It wasn't the first time," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "And it won't be the last." Marcus nodded, his expression understanding. "No, it won't," he said gently. "But that doesn't mean you have to carry it alone. There are people who want to help, who want to make sure you don't have to face this kind of thing by yourself." Lisa looked away, her gaze fixed on the window as she tried to compose herself. She hated feeling vulnerable, hated the idea of someone seeing her as anything less than strong. But in Marcus's presence, she didn't feel judged. She felt seen. The silence between them stretched for a few moments before Marcus reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small card. He placed it on the table, sliding it toward her. "This is my number," he said. "If you ever want to talk, or if you just need someone to remind you that you're not invisible, give me a call." Lisa stared at the card for a moment, the words blurring slightly as her vision misted. She hadn't realized how much she needed to hear those words, how much she had been yearning for someone to acknowledge her struggles without diminishing them. "Thanks," she said finally, her voice thick with emotion. She slipped the card into her pocket, unsure if she would ever use it, but grateful for the gesture nonetheless. Marcus stood, his movements unhurried. "Take care of yourself, Sergeant," he said, his tone warm. "And remember, you're not alone." As he walked away, Lisa felt a strange mix of emotions: gratitude, relief, and a lingering sadness she couldn't quite shake. She hadn't expected to find allies today, hadn't expected anyone to see her beyond the surface. But Sarah and Marcus had reminded her that not everyone judged her by her uniform or the bag she carried. There were still people who cared, who understood. The cafe began to settle back into its rhythm, the soft hum of conversation resuming around her. But Lisa knew that something had shifted. The tension that had filled the room earlier had dissipated, replaced by a quiet sense of possibility. As she sipped her coffee, her thoughts drifted to Emily. The young waitress had made a mistake born out of fear and misunderstanding. But she had also shown courage in owning up to it, in trying to make amends. Lisa wasn't sure if she was ready to forgive her completely, but she knew that holding on to anger wouldn't serve either of them. Her gaze shifted to the counter, where Emily stood, her posture still tense, but her expression softer. Their eyes met briefly, and Lisa gave her a small nod, an unspoken acknowledgement that they were both trying, in their own ways, to move forward. For the first time that morning, Lisa felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to remind her that she wasn't just a soldier, or a veteran, or a woman carrying a heavy bag. She was a person, trying to find her place in a world that didn't always understand her. And maybe, just maybe, she was beginning to find it. The weight of understanding. The hum of the cave continued to swirl around Lisa, but her mind was elsewhere, focused on the unspoken weight that lingered between her and Emily. The earlier confrontation had left her drained, but it also brought a sense of clarity. She wasn't angry anymore, not entirely, but she couldn't deny the sting of what had transpired. Being seen as a threat, even for a fleeting moment, cut deeper than she cared to admit. Lisa stared down at the now empty coffee cup in front of her, the residual warmth fading against her palms. She wanted to let the morning slip away, to leave it behind like a bad dream, but something held her in place. It wasn't the coffee, or even the comfort of the cozy cafe. It was the unfinished conversation with Emily. From her peripheral vision, Lisa noticed Emily lingering near the counter. The young woman's movements were hesitant, her shoulders tense as she wiped down the countertop for the third time in as many minutes. Lisa knew that look. It was the look of someone grappling with guilt, someone unsure of how to fix what they had broken. It mirrored the emotions Lisa herself had felt countless times after making decisions she wished she could undo. Finally, Lisa stood. She took a deep breath, her military training kicking in as she steadied herself, then crossed the room to the counter. The quiet shuffle of her boots on the tiled floor caught Emily's attention. The waitress looked up, her face a mixture of apprehension and hope. "I need a refill," Lisa said simply, holding out her mug. Her tone was calm, her expression neutral, but the words carried more weight than their simplicity suggested. Emily blinked, momentarily caught off guard, before nodding quickly. "Of course," she said, her voice soft. She reached for the coffee pot, her hand shaking slightly as she poured. The stream of coffee wavered for a moment, spilling a few drops onto the counter. Emily started, her words faltering as she set the pot down. She wiped at the spill with a napkin, her movements hurried, almost frantic. "I'm really sorry about earlier. I didn't mean to. Well, I did, but I wasn't thinking clearly. I'm sorry." Lisa watched her for a moment, her expression unreadable. She could see the genuine remorse in Emily's eyes, the way her shoulders hunched as though she were bracing for judgment. For a brief moment, Lisa saw herself in the young waitress. The uncertainty, the weight of responsibility, the fear of having done irreparable harm. "It's not easy to admit when you're wrong," Lisa said finally, her voice steady but not unkind. "I know that better than most." Emily looked up, her eyes wide with surprise. She hadn't expected Lisa to respond so calmly, so openly. I wasn't trying to hurt you," Emily stammered. "I was just scared. With everything you see on the news these days, She broke off, her words catching in her throat. Lisa nodded, understanding. "Fear does strange things to people," she said. "It makes you see threats where there aren't any. I've seen it happen on battlefields, and I've seen it happen in places like this." She gestured vaguely around the cafe. "But fear isn't an excuse to stop thinking. You're better than that." Emily's face flushed, and she nodded quickly. "I know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know I messed up. And I can't take it back, but I want to make it right." Lisa considered her words, the sincerity in them. She thought of all the times she had been in Emily's position, grappling with the consequences of a decision she couldn't undo. The memory of those moments softened her resolve, her frustration giving way to something more constructive. "Making it right doesn't mean erasing what happened," Lisa said. "It means learning from it. It means making sure you don't let fear cloud your judgment next time." Emily nodded again, her hands gripping the edge of the counter as though it were the only thing keeping her grounded. "I will," she said. "I promise." Lisa took the mug of coffee Emily had refilled, the warmth of it grounding her. For a moment, she simply stood there, the silence between them stretching. Then, in a gesture that surprised even herself, she extended her free hand toward Emily. "You can call me Lisa," she said. Emily hesitated, her eyes flicking from Lisa's hand to her face. Then, slowly, she reached out and shook Lisa's hand. Her grip was tentative at first, but it steadied as the connection lingered. "Emily," she said softly. "It's good to meet you, Emily," Lisa said, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. For the first time that morning, Emily smiled back. It was small, hesitant, but it was genuine. As Lisa returned to her table, she felt a shift within herself. The morning had been fraught with tension and misunderstandings, but this moment, this small act of connection, felt like progress. It wasn't forgiveness, not entirely, but it was a step toward understanding. She sat down and sipped her coffee, letting the warmth seep into her. The cafe around her had returned to its usual rhythm, the earlier tension dissipating into the hum of conversation and the clinking of cups. For the first time, Lisa felt like she could breathe. But the peace was short-lived. The door to the cafe swung open, and a man in a suit entered, his expression tense. He was tall and thin, with sharp features and an air of authority. His eyes scanned the room before landing on Lisa. He approached her table without hesitation. "Sergeant Johnson," he said, his tone brisk. "I'm Agent Mitchell, Department of Defense." Lisa's body stiffened instinctively, her years of training kicking in. "What's this about?" she asked, her voice calm but edged with suspicion. Mitchell glanced around the cafe, his expression unreadable. "It's about the duffel bag," he said, his voice low. "We need to talk." Lisa's heart sank. She had hoped the morning's drama was behind her, but it seemed her troubles were far from over. Setting down her coffee, she met Mitchell's gaze head-on. "Then let's talk," she said, her voice steady. The cafe, once again, grew silent as Lisa stood, ready to face whatever was coming next. This time, though, she wasn't just standing for herself. She was standing for the understanding she had fought to earn, for the truth that had been overshadowed by fear, and she wasn't about to back down. A deeper truth. Agent Mitchell motioned toward the far corner of the cafe, away from the other patrons. Lisa followed him, her steps measured and deliberate. The faint murmur of the cafe faded into the background as they reached a small, unoccupied area near the rear of the room. Mitchell gestured for her to sit, his demeanor calm but unyielding. Lisa complied, her eyes locked on him as he settled into the chair across from her. She placed her mug on the table, her hands resting firmly in her lap. Her military training surged to the forefront of her mind. The discipline and composure she had honed over years of service, now second nature. If this man was from the Department of Defense, the situation was serious. But why? And why now? Mitchell reached into his jacket and pulled out a slim tablet. He tapped the screen, his fingers moving with practiced precision as he pulled up a document. When he finally looked at Lisa, his eyes were sharp, appraising her with the precision of someone used to reading people in an instant. "Sergeant Johnson," he began, his voice low and professional. "I'll get straight to the point. That duffel bag you're carrying, it's drawn some attention." Lisa's eyes narrowed slightly. "It's just my personal belongings," she said evenly. "Nothing more." Mitchell's expression didn't waver. "I understand. But it's not the contents of the bag that are the issue. It's where it's been." Lisa stiffened, her mind racing. What was he implying? The bag was old, worn from years of use, but it was hers. It had been with her through countless deployments, a silent witness to the trials she had endured. How could its history possibly matter now? Mitchell tapped the tablet again, turning it so Lisa could see the screen. A series of images appeared, surveillance photos of her at various locations. Airports, train stations, the cafe itself. Each image was time-stamped, and a chill ran down Lisa's spine as she realized just how closely she had been monitored. "You've been flagged," Mitchell said, his tone matter-of-fact. "Not because of anything you've done, but because of where you've been. This bag," he gestured toward the duffel beside her, "has passed through zones of interest, high-risk areas, places where sensitive materials have gone missing." Lisa's jaw tightened. "Are you accusing me of something?" she asked, her voice steady but carrying a sharp edge. Mitchell raised a hand, his expression neutral. "No accusations, Sergeant, but we need to ensure there's no misunderstanding. It's standard procedure." Lisa exhaled slowly, forcing herself to stay calm. The accusation wasn't direct, but the insinuation was clear. "You think my bag might be carrying something dangerous?" she asked, her voice laced with disbelief. "After everything I've done for this country, you're questioning me over a piece of luggage." Mitchell leaned forward slightly, his gaze unrelenting. "This isn't about questioning your service or your loyalty. It's about protocol. Your movements, combined with the current climate of heightened security, have triggered a review. I'm here to clear it up." Lisa's hands curled into fists beneath the table, but she kept her voice measured. "Fine. Clear it up then. What do you want from me?" Mitchell tapped the tablet again, pulling up a detailed list of locations where her bag had been flagged. As he began to explain the patterns and potential risks, Lisa's mind drifted for a moment, her thoughts spiraling back to the last time she had been scrutinized like this. It was years ago, during her final deployment. She had been tasked with overseeing the transport of classified materials through a volatile region. The mission had gone smoothly, at least on the surface. But weeks later, whispers of a leak had surfaced. Though she had been cleared of any wrongdoing, the experience had left a mark on her, a lingering sense of distrust from those around her. Now, sitting across from Agent Mitchell, that same feeling crept back in. "Sergeant," Mitchell's voice broke through her thoughts. Lisa blinked, refocusing on him. "I'm listening," she said curtly. "We're not here to cause you trouble," Mitchell continued, his tone softening slightly. "But we need your cooperation. If there's nothing to hide, this will be quick and painless." Lisa studied him for a long moment. His face betrayed no malice, only the detached professionalism of someone doing their job. Still, the idea of being scrutinized, of being doubted, stung deeply. "Fine," she said finally. She reached for the duffel bag, her movements deliberate as she unzipped it. "Let's get this over with." Mitchell nodded, watching as she laid the contents of the bag out on the table, a neatly folded change of clothes, a well-worn book, a toiletry kit, and a small notebook. Each item was unremarkable, a snapshot of a life in transit. Lisa's hands moved with precision, her military discipline evident even in this small act. Mitchell examined each item briefly before looking up at her. "Thank you for your cooperation," he said. As I suspected, there's nothing here to be concerned about. Lisa's lips pressed into a thin line. I could have told you that, she muttered. Mitchell leaned back, his expression softening. I understand this isn't easy, he said. Being questioned, being doubted, it's not fair. But in my line of work, trust has to be earned, not assumed. Lisa met his gaze, her frustration simmering just beneath the surface. And what about my trust? She asked, her voice quiet but firm. Do you think I'm going to trust you after this? Mitchell hesitated, his composure faltering for the first time. I hope so, he said eventually, because despite how it feels, we're on the same side. Lisa didn't respond immediately. Instead, she began packing her belongings back into the duffel, her movements sharp and efficient. If we're on the same side, she said finally, then maybe you should start treating people like allies, not suspects. Mitchell nodded slowly, as though considering her words. Fair enough, he said. He stood, tucking the tablet back into his jacket. Thank you for your time, Sergeant. I'll make sure this incident doesn't go any further. As he turned to leave, Lisa felt a pang of mixed emotions. Relief, anger, and a lingering sense of unease. She had cleared her name, but the experience had left a bitter taste in her mouth. As Mitchell exited the cafe, Lisa sat back down at her table, her duffel bag now securely zipped. The room felt different now, quieter, more subdued. She sipped her coffee, the warmth grounding her once again. From the corner of her eye, she noticed Emily watching her from behind the counter. The young waitress's expression was conflicted, a mix of guilt and curiosity. Lisa knew the morning's events had affected Emily too, had forced her to confront her own biases and fears. Before she could decide whether to approach Emily again, the door to the cafe opened, and a familiar figure stepped inside. It was Sarah, her warm energy cutting through the tension in the room like a beacon. Looks like I missed some excitement, Sarah said as she approached Lisa's table, her smile faint but genuine. Lisa chuckled softly, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. You could say that. Sarah pulled out a chair and sat down, her eyes scanning Lisa's face. You okay? Lisa nodded, though the answer felt more complicated than a single gesture could convey. I'm fine, she said. Just another day in the life. Sarah's expression softened, and she reached across the table, her hand resting lightly on Lisa's. You're not alone in this, she said quietly. Remember that. For the first time in hours, Lisa felt a sense of calm wash over her. The morning had tested her in ways she hadn't expected, but it had also reminded her of something important. She wasn't defined by how others saw her. She was defined by her own strength, her resilience, and her ability to rise above. And as she sat there with Sarah, the warmth of the coffee and the quiet hum of the cafe surrounding her, she felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep going. Redemption and reconnection. The quiet hum of the cafe returned to its usual rhythm, yet Lisa could still feel the residual tension lingering in the air. The events of the morning weighed on her like an invisible burden, pressing into her chest with each breath. She had been tested in ways she hadn't anticipated, but she had endured. Now, as she sat across from Sarah, sipping her coffee, Lisa felt the faint stirrings of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Hope. Sarah, ever perceptive, broke the silence with a soft but pointed question. Do you think you'll reach out to that agent? Mitchell, was it? Lisa glanced at her duffel bag, now securely zipped at her feet. The interaction with Mitchell had left her with a sour taste, not because of the questioning itself, but because of what it symbolized. A persistent shadow of suspicion that followed her even in peacetime. Probably not, she admitted. He did his job, but I'm not exactly itching to make friends with someone who treated me like a potential threat. Sarah nodded, her gaze thoughtful. Fair enough, she said, but don't let him take up space in your head. People like that, they're just cogs in the machine. They don't define you. Lisa smiled faintly. That's easier said than done. The two women sat in companionable silence for a moment, the unspoken understanding between them a balm for Lisa's frayed nerves. Sarah's presence reminded Lisa of the bonds she had shared with her comrades during her years of service, the kind of connection that didn't require words to convey its depth. It was a reminder that even in the midst of adversity, she wasn't truly alone. Across the cafe, Emily watched the pair from her station at the counter. She had been hovering there for the past several minutes, her hands busy with trivial tasks, as she built up the courage to approach Lisa again. She knew her earlier apology had been insufficient. Words alone couldn't undo the harm she had caused. But she also knew that avoiding the situation would only compound her guilt. Finally, Emily took a deep breath and stepped out from behind the counter. Her movements were hesitant, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. She stopped a few feet away from Lisa's table, her gaze flickering between Lisa and Sarah. Excuse me," she began, her voice trembling slightly. Lisa looked up, her expression unreadable. Sarah, sensing the weight of the moment, leaned back slightly in her chair, giving Emily the space to speak. Emily's voice faltered, but she pressed on. "I just wanted to say, I know I already apologized, but I feel like it wasn't enough. What I did earlier, it wasn't fair. I judged you without knowing anything about you, and that was wrong." Lisa studied Emily for a moment, her sharp gaze taking in the young woman's posture, her tone, and the sincerity in her words. "You're right," Lisa said finally, her voice calm but firm. "It wasn't fair, but the fact that you're standing here now, owning up to it, that means something." Emily's eyes widened slightly, as though she hadn't expected such a measured response. "It doesn't excuse what I did," she said, "but I want you to know, I'm going to do better. I'm going to think before I act next time." Lisa nodded slowly, the tension in her shoulders easing just a fraction. "Good," she said, "because the next person you judge like that might not be as willing to hear you out." Emily's cheeks flushed, but she nodded. "Thank you," she said softly, "for giving me a chance to make this right." Lisa didn't respond immediately. Instead, she reached into her duffel bag and pulled out a small, well-worn patch, a simple American flag emblem that had been sewn onto her uniform during her years of service. She held it out to Emily. "Take this," Lisa said, "not as a token or a reward, but as a reminder. Every time you see it, I want you to remember that people aren't always what they seem, and that the weight someone carries might be heavier than you can imagine." Emily hesitated for a moment before taking the patch, her fingers brushing against the fabric with a reverence she couldn't quite explain. "Thank you," she said again, her voice barely above a whisper. Lisa nodded, her expression softening. "Just don't forget." As Emily returned to the counter, clutching the patch tightly in her hand, Lisa leaned back in her chair, exhaling deeply. The exchange had taken more out of her than she cared to admit, but it also left her with a sense of closure. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was enough. "You handled that well," Sarah said, her voice breaking the silence. "Better than I would have, honestly." Lisa shrugged. "It's not about handling it," she said. "It's about moving forward. Holding on to anger doesn't help anyone. Not me, not her." Sarah smiled, a glint of admiration in her eyes. "You're stronger than you give yourself credit for, Lisa." The compliment caught Lisa off guard, but she didn't shy away from it. Instead, she allowed herself a small smile in return. "Maybe," she said, "but some days it doesn't feel like it." Sarah reached across the table, her hand resting lightly on Lisa's. "That's what makes you strong. The fact that you keep going, even when it doesn't feel like enough." Lisa didn't respond, but the warmth of Sarah's words settled in her chest, a quiet reassurance she hadn't realized she needed. The morning sun streamed through the cafe windows, casting golden light across the floor. The energy in the room had shifted once again, not back to the bustling chaos of earlier, but to something quieter, more reflective. Lisa glanced out the window, watching as the city continued to move around her. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she could take a breath without the weight of the past pressing down on her. She wasn't naive enough to believe that one morning in a cave could erase years of struggle, but she knew that change often began with small steps. A conversation, a moment of connection, a simple act of kindness. As Sarah stood to leave, she gave Lisa one last, lingering look. "You've got my number," she said. "Call me if you ever need someone to talk to." Lisa nodded, her expression soft. "I will." As Sarah walked out of the cafe, Lisa took one last sip of her coffee, savoring the warmth. She didn't know what the rest of the day would bring, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. And that, she realized, was enough. The journey forward. Lisa watched Sarah leave, her presence lingering like a warm ember in the otherwise cool atmosphere of the cafe. For the first time that day, Lisa allowed herself a small, genuine smile. The chaos of the morning had stirred wounds she hadn't realized were still raw. But the moments of connection, first with Sarah, then with Emily, felt like salves on her frayed spirit. She looked down at the table, her fingers absently tracing the edge of her coffee mug. The duffel bag at her feet seemed lighter now, not because its weight had changed, but because the burden it symbolized felt a little easier to carry. Lisa had always been strong. She'd had to be, but she was beginning to see that strength wasn't just about enduring alone. It was about finding the courage to connect, even when it felt like the world was trying to push her away. Emily approached again, more confidently this time, her apron folded over one arm. "Hey," she said softly, a small but genuine smile on her face. "I'm off the clock now, but I wanted to check on you before I left." Lisa looked up, surprised by the young woman's persistence. "I'm fine," she said, her tone even. "Better than I was this morning, anyway." Emily nodded, her gaze steady. "Good. I'm glad. And I know you probably hear this a lot, but thank you for your service. Not just for what you did out there." She gestured vaguely, as if referring to some distant battlefield. "But for the patience you showed me today. I've got a lot to learn." Lisa tilted her head, studying Emily for a moment. "We all do," she said. "The important thing is that you're willing to learn. That's more than most people can say." Emily's cheeks flushed, but her smile widened. "Thanks," she said. "I'll remember that." As Emily turned to leave, Lisa felt a surprising sense of pride. She hadn't just survived the morning. She'd made a difference, however small. And that, she realized, was worth more than a quiet cup of coffee. Lisa finished her drink and stood, shouldering her duffel bag. The cafe had returned to its usual rhythm, the earlier tension now a distant memory. But as she made her way to the door, she noticed something new. A few of the patrons who had watched the confrontation unfold were now smiling at her, nodding subtly in acknowledgement. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind her that she wasn't invisible, that her presence mattered. Stepping outside, Lisa was greeted by the crisp autumn air. The city buzzed around her, alive with the sounds of a world moving forward. She took a deep breath, savoring the coolness against her skin. Her steps were lighter now, her heart steadier. She didn't know what challenges awaited her in the days ahead, but for the first time in a long while, she felt ready to face them. The morning had been difficult, yes, but it had also been a reminder that even in moments of struggle, there was room for growth, for connection, for hope. Lisa tightened the strap of her duffel bag and walked toward the horizon, the sunlight breaking through the clouds above. She didn't need all the answers, not today. All she needed was the strength to take the next step. And step by step, she would move forward, carrying not just the weight of her past, but also the quiet promise of a better future.